Daniel Whitmore was one of the most successful young businessmen in the city. At just 30 years old, he had become the CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech company. His days were filled with meetings, investor pitches, and business dinners at the most exclusive restaurants. To him, life was about money and power, nothing more. But that day, in a rush to make it to a meeting on time, he decided to take a different route. And that one walk would change his life forever. As Daniel walked through the city park, something caught his eye. A man sitting on a bench. A homeless man. His coat was worn and tattered, his hands cracked from the cold. Beside him sat nothing but an old, weathered backpack. But what made Daniel stop were the man's eyes. They weren't the dull, defeated eyes of someone who had given up on life. They were sharp, deep, and knowing. As if he was someone who once had everything and lost it all. Daniel hesitated for a moment, and then, without really knowing why, he made a decision. "Hey, can I get you a coffee?" The man slowly lifted his head, locking eyes with Daniel. Then, after a moment, he gave a small smile. "Coffee? Sure, why not? I used to love a good cup of coffee." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Used to?" The man nodded. "Yeah, back when I was making million-dollar business deals, driving luxury cars, running board meetings." Daniel froze. A homeless man, making million-dollar business deals? Was this a joke? But there was no sign of dishonesty in the man's gaze. Curious, Daniel exhaled and asked, "Tell me your story." The man smiled. "Of course, kid, but first, let's get that coffee." Daniel sat down next to the homeless man, handing him a hot cup of coffee. He still couldn't wrap his head around it. This man had once been rich? Was that even possible? But there was something in his eyes, a hidden truth. "What's your name?" Daniel asked. The man took a sip of his coffee and smirked slightly. "Richard Sterling." Daniel's eyebrows shot up. That name, it sounded familiar. Then it hit him. "Sterling Enterprises, was that your company? The big finance firm?" Richard nodded. "Yeah, once upon a time it was." Daniel was stunned. "How? If you owned that company, how are you here? On the streets?" Richard took a deep breath. "Because sometimes, the bigger the fortune, the bigger the mistakes." Daniel leaned in. "What happened?" Richard took another sip of coffee before beginning his story. "Years ago, I was just like you. Young, ambitious, successful. I believed in money and power. I didn't care about people. The only thing that mattered was growing and winning." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine, because this man sounded exactly like him. Richard continued, "I thought I had everything under control, but I made one mistake, and that mistake ruined my life." Daniel held his breath. Richard shoved his hands into his coat pockets, the cold wind biting at his skin as he kept talking. A huge investment opportunity came up, a massive real estate deal, but there was corruption in the project. I didn't notice it, or maybe I just didn't want to. I didn't care about people. But when it all collapsed, my entire fortune was frozen. My company went bankrupt, and I ended up here. Daniel was speechless. "But how do you lose everything?" Richard let out a bitter chuckle. "Because I never protected myself. My entire fortune was tied to one investment. And when that investment failed, so did I. That's when I realized something." He turned and looked Daniel in the eye. True wealth isn't just money. Because if you lose everything and no one stands by you, starting over is impossible. Daniel sat there, frozen. For the first time, he thought about his own life. He had success. He had money. But if he lost it all tomorrow, who would be there for him? Had he ever even thought about that? number. And now, for the first time, he was. And the thought scared him. Daniel couldn't stop thinking about what Richard had said. A former billionaire was now sitting in a park, all because of one bad decision. But something else was bothering Daniel. Didn't anyone help you? Your old friends? Business partners? Richard gave a small, sad smile. No one was left, kid, because I never invested in people. Only money. Daniel let out a slow breath. He had always believed that money was the only thing that mattered. But what if he was wrong? So, you trusted the wrong people? Daniel asked. Richard shook his head. No, I didn't trust anyone. I did everything alone. That was my biggest mistake. Daniel had never heard something like this before. His entire life, he had been taught that being independent was the key to success. But Richard was saying the opposite. When you have money, people surround you, Richard continued. But the real test is, who stays when the money is gone? Daniel just sat there, listening. Richard finished his coffee and placed the empty cup into his bag. Look, kid, being rich isn't a bad thing, but if all you invest in is money, and never in people, then when the money's gone, you'll have nothing. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt something shift inside him. But was he ready to accept it? Daniel thought about his life. He had power. He had wealth. But if he lost everything tomorrow, who would be there for him? His employees? His business partners? Or would he end up just like Richard? Alone? That single thought shook him. For the first time, he wasn't sure of what he believed. Daniel couldn't shake Richard's words. True wealth isn't just money. If you don't invest in people, you'll lose everything. The sentence echoed in his mind, and deep down, he knew it was true. But now, the real question was, how could he help Richard? Daniel took a deep breath and turned to Richard. Look, I have a job for you. Come work for me. You can start fresh. Richard smiled slightly, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Daniel hesitate. Why are you doing this? Richard asked. Daniel paused for a moment. Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm afraid of ending up like you. Richard narrowed his eyes. If that's what you're afraid of, then money still controls you, kid. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Richard sighed. You're offering me a job to make yourself feel better. But the real question is, are you actually ready to understand me? Daniel sat in silence. Because Richard was right. He had offered a solution, but he had never actually tried to understand Richard's pain. Richard gazed at the horizon and continued his story. I used to be just like you. All about business, all about winning. But you know what's funny? By the time I realized my biggest mistake, it was too late. I lost people. My wife, my friends, my employees, everyone. Daniel thought about his own life. He too had always seen his employees as numbers instead of people. He had never built real relationships. And now, for the first time, he was questioning everything. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, he spoke. All right, let's do this differently. I'm not offering you a job, but let me help you. Richard squinted. How? Daniel smirked slightly. First, let's get you a hot meal. Then, we'll figure out how to start over. Together. Richard was silent. Then, for the first time, he gave a small, real nod. Daniel had spent his whole life focused on business. But for the first time, he just wanted to help another person. And maybe this was his new beginning too. Daniel took Richard to a cafe. For the first time, he wasn't trying to save someone. He genuinely wanted to learn about him. But Richard wasn't talking much. It felt like he was hiding something, and Daniel had to find out what it was. As they sipped their coffee, Daniel took a deep breath. "Richard, I need to ask you something, and I want the truth." Richard raised an eyebrow. "You won't know until you ask, kid." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "How did you survive all these years? Did everyone really abandon you?" Richard sighed. He stayed silent for a few seconds. Then, slowly, he spoke. "Everyone left, except for one person." Daniel leaned in. "Who?" Richard stared at the table. His eyes watered. "My son." Daniel froze. "Your son?" Richard nodded. "Yeah, but I was never a good father. I neglected him for work. In the end, he walked away from me." For the first time, Daniel felt Richard's story, because he, too, had grown up without a father. Now, for the first time, he wasn't just seeing Richard's regrets. He was facing his own fears. "Where is your son now?" Daniel asked. Richard shook his head. "I don't know. Last time we spoke, he told me, 'I'll never be like you,' and left. I haven't heard from him since." Daniel felt a sting in his chest. He realized that Richard's biggest loss wasn't money. It was being forgotten by his own son. That's why. Daniel decided to give him a second chance. "Richard, I don't just want to get you off the streets. I want to help you get your family back." Richard narrowed his eyes. "And when did this become your job, kid?" Daniel smirked slightly. "It's not my job, Richard. It's my first real test of being human." And for the first time, something changed in Richard's eyes. For the first time, he looked hopeful. Daniel wasn't making a business deal. For the first time, he was truly trying to change someone's life. And it had nothing to do with money. He wanted to find Richard's son. But the real question was, did his son even want to see him? Daniel dug into old archives from Richard's former company. He finally found something. Richard's son, Lucas Sterling, had moved to another city and started a small software company. Daniel managed to track down his contact info and sent him a simple message. "You haven't seen your father in years, but he never forgot you. Maybe you should talk to him, just once. If you're willing, meet us here." After sending it, all he could do was wait. Richard wasn't optimistic. "He's not coming, kid. He won't forgive me." But Daniel didn't believe that. "If you really thought he'd never come, you wouldn't be here right now, Richard." That evening, Daniel and Richard sat in a small cafe. Richard kept glancing at the door, but there was no sign of Lucas. Richard sighed. "Told you, he's not coming." Daniel was about to respond when the door opened. Lucas walked in, his eyes locked onto the familiar but aged face across the room. Richard held his breath. Lucas spoke first, his voice flat. "You wanted to see me?" Richard stared at his son. "Lucas, I just wanted to see you, and to apologize." Lucas shook his head. "Apologize? You spent years choosing your company over me, and now suddenly you care?" Richard swallowed hard. "I lost everything. My company, my fortune. But losing you was the worst thing of all." Lucas hesitated. Richard's voice cracked. "I know I can't change the past, but if you let me, maybe we can build something for the future." Lucas was silent for a long moment. Then, for the first time, he really looked at his father. "On one condition," Lucas said finally. "No matter what, you don't disappear again." Richard's eyes filled with tears. "I promise, son." And at that moment, the bond they had lost was rebuilt. A few weeks later, Richard and Lucas started reconnecting. Daniel watched it all unfold, and he realized something. He hadn't helped Richard just for him. He had done it because he was afraid of becoming him. If all he did was chase money and ignore people, one day he might end up just like Richard. And for the first time, he understood. True wealth isn't making money. It's making meaningful connections.
If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Subscribe for more inspiring stories.